On Father's Day, my millionaire son, Jared, came to visit and asked, "Dad, are you happy with the $8,000 Lauren sends you every month?" I hesitated, looking around my freezing apartment, and replied softly, "Son, the church food pantry is keeping me alive these days." And right then, his elegant wife walked in. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe the truth always comes to light, no matter how hard someone tries to hide it. I am Oscar Blake, 72 years old, and a retired corporate auditor. You would think a man who spent 40 years tracking missing funds, analyzing massive ledgers, and exposing financial fraud for major firms would have secured a comfortable, easy retirement. But life has a remarkably cruel way of balancing its scales. My world began to shrink 10 years ago when my beautiful wife Diane passed away. We had a good life, a quiet life built on honesty and hard work. When she got sick, the medical bills piled up fast. After she was gone, I sold our family home, the house where we raised our only son, Jared. I drained the last of my savings to pay off the medical debt and to fund Jared's final years of college, as well as his early software startup ventures. I gave him everything, every single penny I had to my name, because that is simply what a father does. You sacrifice your own comfort to ensure your child can fly. Jared took that sacrifice and built an absolute empire. He became a highly successful software CEO and a millionaire before he even turned 35. I, on the other hand, ended up in a dilapidated, drafty apartment in a forgotten, crumbling corner of Chicago. The winters here are completely unforgiving. The wind howls off the lake and rattles the thin single-pane glass of my living room window. The old iron radiator in the corner clanks and hisses all night long but barely pushes out any real heat. Most days I am forced to wear 2 heavy wool sweaters indoors just to stop my hands from shaking. I survive purely on the kindness of the local community church. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, regardless of the biting frost or the heavy snow, I walk 6 blocks to stand in line at the food pantry. Canned chicken noodle soup, stale bread, and powdered milk. That has become my daily reality. I never once complained to Jared about my living situation. He is a busy man running a massive global company, constantly traveling across the country for meetings and conferences. Whenever we spoke on the phone, he always told me he had set up a dedicated family trust for me. He said his wife Lauren was personally managing the account to make sure I was completely taken care of. I assumed the trust was just a safety net, a digital pool of funds meant for emergencies or for when my health eventually failed. I never saw a single dime of it, and I was far too proud to ever ask. I figured they needed the capital to keep growing their business. I accepted my invisible, quiet life, finding a stubborn kind of dignity in my silence and my survival. But an auditor's mind never truly retires. Even as my joints ache and my steps slow down with age, my brain constantly calculates, observes, and measures the discrepancies in the world around me. I just never expected to find the most massive, heartbreaking discrepancy inside my own family. It was Father's Day, a Sunday afternoon. The sky outside was a heavy, oppressive gray, and the wind was particularly brutal. I was sitting at my small chipped laminate kitchen table, slowly eating a bowl of lukewarm canned soup that I had brought home from the pantry the day before. I had not expected any visitors. Jared usually sent a quick text message or had his assistant mail a generic greeting card. I was completely alone with my thoughts, listening to the wind rattle the glass. But suddenly, there was a heavy, urgent knock on my peeling wooden door. I pushed myself up from this table, my knees popping in protest, and slowly made my way across the warped linoleum floor. When I unlatched the deadbolt and pulled the door open, there stood Jared. He was wearing a custom-tailored cashmere coat, an expensive watch gleaming on his wrist, looking every bit the incredibly successful executive he had become. But the moment his eyes adjusted to the dim, depressing light of my apartment, his confident, happy smile completely vanished. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His polished leather shoes crunched against the uneven floorboards. He looked up at the peeling paint on the water-damaged ceiling. He looked at the single, inadequate space heater I had plugged into an overloaded wall outlet. And then he looked down at my meager bowl of watery canned soup resting on the bare table. He looked absolutely horrified. "Dad," he said, his voice trembling slightly as he took off his leather gloves. "What is this place? What are you doing here?" I was deeply confused by his reaction. "This is my home, Jared," I answered calmly. "I have lived in this apartment for 3 years now." He ran a trembling hand through his hair, looking frantically around the freezing, cramped room, as if he had just walked into a nightmare. "But the condo," he stammered, taking a step closer to me. "Lauren said she moved you into that luxury senior living community downtown. She sends me photos of the amenities, the indoor pool, the dining hall, the medical staff. She said you loved it there." I just stared at my son, trying to process his words. "What condo?" I asked, gently shaking my head. "I have never lived in a luxury condo, Jared." Jared's face went completely pale, all the color draining from his cheeks. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling rapidly through his messages. "Dad," he said, his voice rising in panic. "Lauren manages the family trust. I instructed her to make sure you wanted for nothing. I set it up so you would have the best care in the city." He looked up at me, his eyes wide with genuine shock and confusion. "Dad, are you happy with the $8,000 Lauren sends you every month?" The number hung in the freezing air between us like a physical weight. $8,000 a month. My auditor's brain instantly did the math. That was $96,000 a year. That kind of money could have completely changed my existence. It could have bought me reliable warmth, fresh groceries, new clothes, and a safe, comfortable place to live out my final years. For a moment, I was entirely speechless. I hesitated. I did not want to cause a massive rift between my son and his wife, but I simply could not lie to him. The truth was too heavy to carry alone anymore. "Son," I replied softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "No one is sending me any money. The church food pantry is keeping me alive these days." Jared took a physical step back, staggering slightly, as if I had just punched him in the chest. Before Jared could even attempt to process my words or say another sentence, the apartment door swung open again. In walked Lauren. The visual contrast between her and my dismal surroundings was almost comical and deeply insulting. She was 36 years old, dressed in a pristine white designer wool coat that probably cost more than my annual rent. She was carrying a luxury leather handbag, and the overpowering scent of her expensive floral perfume immediately masked the damp, musty smell of my apartment. She stopped dead in her tracks the exact moment she saw Jared standing there in the middle of the room. For a fraction of a second, just a fleeting micro-expression, I saw pure, unadulterated panic flash across her eyes. She froze. She knew she was caught. She knew the grand illusion she had built was completely shattered. But Lauren was an absolute master manipulator, a predator hiding behind a beautiful face. In the blink of an eye, the genuine panic vanished, instantly replaced by an expression of deep, tragic sorrow. "Jared, honey," she cried out, her voice shaking with perfectly faked emotion. She dropped her designer bag on a chair, rushed to his side, and grabbed his arm tightly. "I did not want you to see him like this. I tried so hard to protect you from seeing this reality." Jared looked down at her, entirely bewildered and visibly angry. "Protect me from what, Lauren?" he demanded, pulling his arm away. "He just told me he lives off a church food pantry. Where is the $8,000 a month? Where is the luxury condo you told me about?" Lauren let out a dramatic theatrical sob, pressing her perfectly manicured fingers against her trembling lips. She looked at me with wide eyes full of fake, condescending pity. "Oh, Oscar, your poor, broken mind." She turned back to actual tears now streaming down her contoured face. "Jared, I have been depositing the money every single month. I swear to you on my life. But his dementia, it is getting so much worse. The specialist warned me this would happen. He hides the money. He forgets where he puts it. She pointed a trembling finger around the room. He wandered off from this luxury condo 3 months ago and rented this awful place in a state of severe mental confusion. I have been trying every single day to coax him back, but he gets violently aggressive when I try to move him. He thinks everyone is stealing from him. It is the paranoia, Jared. The sickness is taking over his brain. I stood there by my kitchen table, absolutely frozen by the sheer, terrifying audacity of her lies. Dementia. Wandering off. Paranoia. I had never set foot in a luxury condo in my entire life. My mind was sharper than it had ever been. She was spinning a web of deceit so thick, so fast, and with such incredible emotional conviction that Jared, desperate to make sense of the nightmare, was actually beginning to listen to her. I watched my son's face transition from righteous anger to deep, tragic, heartbreaking concern. He looked at me not as the father who raised him, but as a broken, sick old man who was rapidly losing his grip on reality. The feeling of being erased by her lies was suffocating. She was stealing my sanity to cover up her theft. Jared rubbed his temples, completely overwhelmed by the crushing emotional weight of the situation. Suddenly, his phone began to buzz loudly in his coat pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. "It is the board of directors," he said, his voice thick with stress and exhaustion. "I have to take this call. Just give me 5 minutes in the hallway to process all of this. Please, just stay here." He stepped out into the drafty, dimly lit hallway, pulling my heavy wooden door shut behind him. The loud metallic click of the latch echoed sharply in the small room. The very moment the door was completely closed, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Lauren's tears stopped immediately. Her crying ceased as if someone had flipped a switch. Her posture straightened, the trembling vanished, and the mask of the grieving, concerned daughter-in-law evaporated completely. What was left behind was a cold, calculating, and ruthless predator. She slowly walked toward me, her designer heels clicking sharply and rhythmically against the linoleum floor. She backed me up against the kitchen counter, stopping mere inches from my face. Her eyes were hard, entirely devoid of any human empathy or warmth. "Listen to me very carefully, old man," she whispered, her voice a venomous, terrifying hiss. You are going to play along with this exactly as I say. When Jared walks back through that door, you are going to act confused. You are going to look around and ask what year it is. You are going to mumble. If you breathe a single word about the money, or if you dare call me a liar to his face again, I will absolutely destroy you." She leaned in even closer, the sickeningly sweet smell of her perfume turning my empty stomach. "I already have the medical power of attorney paperwork drafted and ready to go. I have highly paid doctors on my personal payroll who will sign whatever medical evaluation I tell them to sign. If you cross me, I will have you declared legally incompetent by Tuesday morning. I will throw you into the worst, most violently underfunded state-run psychiatric ward in this entire city. They will drug you so heavily that you will not even be able to remember your own name, and you will rot in a padded room until the day you die. Do you understand me?" I looked deep into the eyes of the woman who had stolen my dignity, my comfort, my retirement, and my son's trust. I realized in that very second that I was not just a neglected old man. I was standing in the middle of a war zone under an active, highly malicious attack. She had all the power, all the money, and my son's ear. But Lauren made one fatal, irreversible mistake. She looked at my wrinkled hands, my stooped posture, and my worn-out clothes, and she only saw a weak, defenseless victim. She completely forgot who I was. She forgot that underneath this gray hair was a man who spent 40 relentless years dismantling corporate thieves, much smarter and much more dangerous than her. I did not scream. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I just stared at her in absolute unbroken silence, letting my shoulders slump. I let her believe she had won. because an auditor knows the golden rule of destruction. You never show your hand, and you never make a sound until you have gathered all the evidence you need to burn their empire to the ground. Lauren stood there waiting for me to scream. She wanted me to yell at her. She wanted me to call her a liar and wave my hands around like a lunatic. If I did that, she would win immediately. She would tell Jared that my outburst was undeniable proof of my failing mind. So I gave her absolutely nothing. In my 40 years of investigating corporate embezzlement, I learned one universal truth about predators. They thrive on the predictable reactions of their victims. When you do not react, they get careless. I let my shoulders slump forward. I let my jaw go slack. I allowed the light to completely fade from my eyes, replacing the sharp gaze of an auditor with the vacant stare of a broken and senile old man. I slowly lowered my head and stared at the peeling linoleum floor. The silence in my freezing apartment stretched out for a very long time. I could hear Lauren breathing heavily. I heard her designer heels shifting slightly as she waited for my counterattack. When none came, she let out a quiet and victorious little scoff. She really thought she had completely broken my spirit with a single threat. She believed her wealth and her venom were enough to crush me into submission. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and Jared stepped back inside the apartment. He rubbed his eyes, looking utterly exhausted from whatever corporate crisis had just demanded his attention in the hallway. He looked at Lauren, who instantly softened her posture. She slipped right back into her role as the deeply concerned and loving wife. Then he looked at me. I knew exactly what I had to do in that moment. I shuffled my feet slowly across the floor. I let my hands tremble just a little bit by my sides. I looked up at Jared with wide and confused eyes. I asked him in a fragile and raspy voice if it was time for dinner yet. I asked him if his mother was coming home soon. Hearing me ask for Diane, who had been gone for 10 years, was the final nail in the coffin. Jared's face crumpled in pure agony. He rushed over and gently held my shoulders. He told me that Mom was not coming back and that everything was going to be all right. Lauren stood right behind him, gently rubbing his back and offering him quiet words of comfort. I watched her over his shoulder. She looked at me with a smirk so subtle that only I could see it. She had him completely fooled, and she thought she had me entirely contained. Jared promised he would get me the best doctors in the city. He promised he would come back tomorrow with a medical team to help me transition into a proper care facility. I just nodded slowly, keeping my eyes vacant, and agreeing to every single thing they said. They stayed for another 20 minutes, treating me like a fragile glass doll that had lost its mind. When they finally walked out my door and the lock clicked shut, I listened to their footsteps fade down the hallway. The very second the building went quiet, the tremor in my hands stopped entirely. I straightened my back, pushing away the ache in my aging joints. The confused and cloudy fog in my eyes vanished. It was instantly replaced by a cold and calculating clarity. Lauren thought I was just an invisible and helpless old man waiting to die in a forgotten corner of Chicago. She had absolutely no idea who she was dealing with. She only saw the faded sweaters and the worn-out shoes. She did not see the man who spent 4 decades ripping apart the financial ledgers of corrupt executives. She did not see the auditor who could track a single missing dollar through a massive labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts. The predator had confidently walked into my territory, assuming I was the prey. I walked over to my small kitchen table and sat down. I pushed the cold bowl of canned soup aside. My mind was already booting up shifting gears and organizing the data. The objective was incredibly clear. $96,000 a year was disappearing. A woman who wore coats worth more than my car was orchestrating the theft. My own son was completely blind to the reality happening right under his nose. I did not need to scream or cry or throw a tantrum. I needed a paper trail. I needed routing numbers. I needed hard and irrefutable data. I closed my eyes and thought about Diane. When she got sick all those years ago, the medical bills were an absolute nightmare. They threatened to swallow everything we had ever built together. After she took her last breath, I was left with a mountain of debt and a son who was halfway through an expensive college degree. I could have easily told Jared to drop out. I could have told him the money was gone and he had to fend for himself. But Diane and I had promised each other we would give our boy the tools to build a better life. So I sold the house we loved. I moved into a tiny rental. I worked my regular auditing job during the day, and at night, I took on freelance forensic accounting for independent firms. I spent countless sleepless nights drinking black coffee, hunting down hidden assets for clients, and exposing corporate thieves who thought they were too smart to get caught. I did the grueling and exhausting work that no one else wanted to do just so I could silently pay Jared's tuition in full. I never told him how hard it was. I never let him see me sweat or struggle. I just wanted him to focus on his software codes and his big dreams. The skills I honed during those long and lonely nights after losing my wife were the very same skills I needed right now. I knew exactly how thieves operated. They always get arrogant. They always believe the people they are stealing from are too stupid or too trusting to look at the details. Lauren assumed she could simply divert my trust fund because she controlled the narrative. She thought her close proximity to Jared gave her absolute immunity from any suspicion. But corporate fraudsters always make a mistake. They buy a luxury car they cannot explain, or they route money through a poorly disguised holding company. Lauren was no different from the corrupt executives I used to put behind bars. She was just another common thief wearing expensive perfume. I opened the bottom drawer of my kitchen cabinet and pulled out a fresh and blank notepad and a blue pen. I wrote down the name of my bank. I wrote down the amount of the monthly deposit Jared claimed he was sending. I began to map out the initial steps of a comprehensive forensic audit. I did not have a fancy office or a team of junior accountants anymore, but I had time, I had patience, and I had a deeply personal motive. Tomorrow morning, the confused old man with dementia would take a slow and quiet walk to the local bank branch. The silent adjustment had officially begun. The next morning arrived with a bitter chill that seeped right through the thin walls of my apartment. The sun was barely rising over the frozen city, but I was already wide awake. I did not feel the exhaustion that usually accompanied my mornings. Instead, I felt a deep and steady current of energy flowing through my veins. I washed my face with cold water and dressed carefully. I bypassed the faded sweaters I wore to the church food pantry and reached into the back of my small closet. I pulled out a heavy wool overcoat that I had kept perfectly clean in a plastic garment bag. It was old, but it commanded respect. I smoothed down the collar and buttoned it up. Today I was not a fragile old man looking for a hot meal. I was a veteran auditor stepping back onto the battlefield. I left my apartment and walked out into the freezing Chicago wind. My joints ached from the cold, but my mind was completely focused on the numbers waiting for me. I walked 4 blocks past the church and headed straight for the large retail bank on the corner of the commercial district. The heavy glass doors slid open, and the warm, conditioned air of the lobby washed over me. The familiar smell of polished marble and fresh coffee brought back a massive flood of memories. For 4 decades, this environment had been my natural habitat. I knew the rhythm of financial institutions. I knew how money moved and how it left a permanent trail. I walked past the line of customers, waiting for the tellers, and headed directly toward the glass-enclosed offices in the back. That is where I found Beverly. She was the branch manager and a woman who possessed a remarkably sharp mind. Beverly had known me for 3 years, ever since I first opened my meager checking account at her branch. She was one of the few people who looked past my gray hair and my modest clothes. We had spent hours talking about financial markets and corporate regulations. She knew exactly how capable I was, and she never once treated me like a senile citizen. I knocked gently on the glass door of her office. Beverly looked up from her computer monitor, and a warm and genuine smile spread across her face. She immediately stood up and gestured for me to come inside. She closed the door behind me, ensuring we had complete privacy in the quiet room. I sat down in the leather chair across from her desk. I did not waste any time with pleasantries or small talk. I looked her squarely in the eyes and told her that I needed to conduct a comprehensive and forensic review of my incoming trust deposits. I told her I suspected a severe financial irregularity involving my accounts. The smile faded from her face, replacing it with a look of intense professional focus. She nodded slowly and turned her attention back to her keyboard. Beverly asked me for my identification, and I handed over my state identification card. She typed rapidly into her terminal, navigating through the complex internal banking software. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the edge of her desk. My heart was beating steadily. I was fully prepared for whatever the numbers were going to reveal. Beverly turned her large monitor around so that we could both see the data populating on the screen. She pulled up the records for the family trust account that Jared had established in my name. We looked at the ledger for the past 12 months. The screen lit up with row after row of transaction history. The first thing I saw brought a strange wave of relief washing over me. On the first day of every single month without fail, an incoming wire transfer was registered. The origin was the corporate trust fund belonging to Jared, and the amount was exactly $8,000. My son had not lied to me about sending the money. He had kept his promise to provide for my retirement. He truly believed he was taking care of me. That realization lifted a heavy weight off my chest, but it was immediately replaced by a burning and calculated anger. Because right below each of those incoming deposits was a second transaction. I leaned closer to the monitor, analyzing the digital timestamps. Less than 30 seconds after the $8,000 cleared into my trust account, an automated sweep was triggered. It was a programmed electronic withdrawal that required absolutely no human intervention once it was initially set up. The outgoing wire transferred exactly $7,800 out of the account. It left behind exactly $200. It was a brilliant and malicious maneuver. By leaving a small fraction of the funds in the account, the balance never dropped to zero. This prevented the bank from sending out any automated letters regarding a dormant or empty account. It was a strategy designed to keep the account breathing just enough to avoid suspicion while bleeding it completely dry. I pulled my blue pen and my notepad from my coat pocket. I asked Beverly to trace the destination of that automated outgoing wire. I needed the routing numbers, the beneficiary names, and the timestamp records for every single transfer. My auditor instincts took over completely. I was no longer a father looking at the money of a son. I was an investigator tracking a thief. Beverly typed another series of commands into her system to track the external routing path. The banking network churned for a few seconds before displaying the final destination. The funds were being wired to a corporate holding account at an entirely different banking institution across the country. The registered beneficiary of the receiving account was a limited liability company. Beverly read the name aloud. The entity was registered as L Prime Holdings. I stared at the name on the screen. The letter L was a glaring and arrogant clue. Lauren had named the shell company after herself. She was so confident in her deception that she did not even bother to properly obscure her tracks. She assumed nobody would ever check the routing history because she believed the only person who could challenge her was a confused and helpless old man. I carefully wrote down the exact name of the shell company. I copied the routing number and the receiving account number onto my notepad. I wrote down the dates of the transfers and the exact amounts stolen over the past 36 months. My hand moved with precision and purpose. The math was devastatingly simple, but entirely irrefutable. She was siphoning $93,600 a year. She was starving me out while building a hidden fortune with the wealth of my son. I thanked Beverly for her help. She looked at me with deep concern in her eyes. She asked me if I wanted her to freeze the account or initiate a fraud investigation through the bank security team. I politely declined her offer. I told her that freezing the account would alert the thief that they were being watched. I explained that I needed the automated transfers to continue for just a little while longer so that I could gather the rest of my evidence. Beverly understood completely. She promised to keep my visit strictly confidential. I stood up from the comfortable leather chair and put my notepad safely into my inside pocket. I walked out of the office of Beverly and made my way back through the warm and busy lobby of the bank. The heavy glass doors parted, and I stepped back out into the freezing Chicago morning. The brutal wind hit my face again, but this time I did not feel the cold at all. I had the raw data, I had the routing numbers, I had the thread. Now all I had to do was pull that thread until the entire world of Lauren unraveled. I began my walk toward the public library to dig into the state business registries. The silent adjustment was moving forward exactly as I planned. The glowing monitor on the wooden desk was the only source of light I cared about in that entire building. Beverly sat across from me with her fingers hovering over the black keyboard. She was completely silent. In the world of finance, silence is never empty. Silence is the sound of a heavy truth waiting to be spoken aloud. I kept my hands folded carefully in my lap. I took a slow and deep breath. The air inside the office smelled of sharp disinfectant and roasted coffee, but all I could focus on was the digital ledger loading on the flat screen. As a retired corporate auditor, I have spent my entire adult life looking at financial records. Numbers are the only language in the world that absolutely cannot lie. People will look you directly in the eyes and tell you a beautiful story. They will cry fake tears. They will hold your hand and promise you the world. But a bank statement does not possess the capacity for deception. A bank statement is a brutal and flawless mirror. I waited patiently as Beverly entered her manager credentials. The system processed the request, and suddenly, the complete history of my family trust account populated on the bright monitor. I leaned forward slightly. The first column of data was a massive relief to my old and tired heart. There they were, the incoming deposits. On the first day of every single month for the past 3 years, a wire transfer had cleared successfully. The sender was listed as the primary corporate trust established by my son. The amount was exactly $8,000. I read the numbers again and again. January $8,000. February $8,000. March $8,000. A warm feeling washed over my chest, completely thawing the freezing cold that had settled in my bones. Jared had told me the truth. My son had not abandoned me to freeze in a crumbling apartment. He had kept his promise. He had truly set aside a small fortune to ensure that the man who sacrificed everything for his education would never have to worry about food or shelter again. The relief was so intense that my eyes watered for a brief second. My boy was still the good and honest man I raised, but that sweet relief was violently shattered just a few seconds later. Beverly frowned and leaned closer to the screen. She adjusted her glasses and moved the mouse. "Mr. Blake," she said softly. Her voice carried a heavy tone of professional confusion. "The incoming deposits are perfectly consistent, but your current available balance does not reflect this history at all. Your balance is practically non-existent. I need to run a trace on the outgoing ledger." I told her to pull the withdrawal records immediately. I knew exactly what was coming. I had seen this exact pattern 1,000 times during my career investigating corporate embezzlement. When you have a massive influx of capital that simply vanishes without a trace, you are not looking at an accounting error. You are looking at a predator. Beverly hit a key and the screen refreshed. A second column of data appeared right beside the incoming deposits. My stomach dropped completely. I felt a cold and venomous anger rising in my throat. Exactly 48 hours after every single $8,000 deposit landed in my trust account, an automated clearinghouse transfer was triggered. It was an electronic sweep. In the banking world, a sweep is a programmed protocol designed to move funds automatically without anyone needing to push a button or sign a check. It is completely invisible to the naked eye unless you know exactly where to look. I read the outgoing amounts. $7,800 every single month. Exactly 48 hours after Jared sent the money. $7,800 was silently sucked out of the account, like blood being drained from a sleeping victim. I did the math instantly in my head. That was $93,600 a year. Over the course of 3 years, that amounted to over $280,000, completely stolen from my survival fund. Beverly looked at me with wide and horrified eyes. She realized exactly what she was looking at. "Someone set up an automated diversion," she whispered. "They are bleeding the trust dry." I nodded slowly, keeping my expression entirely flat. I asked her to look at the remaining balance for each month. Beverly highlighted the final column. $200. After the massive theft was executed, the account was left with exactly $200. It never dropped to zero. I explained the cruel and brilliant mechanics of the theft to Beverly. I told her that if an account hits a zero balance and remains empty, the banking system automatically generates a warning letter. The system mails a physical notice to the account holder, warning them of an inactive or depleted account. The thief knew this perfectly well. By leaving exactly $200, the account remained in good standing. It stayed active. The system never generated a single warning flag. The thief intentionally left me just enough money to buy cheap powdered milk and a few cans of watery soup. They left me $200 so I would not starve to death too quickly. They needed me alive just long enough to keep the $8,000 deposits rolling in from my oblivious son. The sheer malice of that calculation took my breath away. It was not just greedy. It was deeply and profoundly evil. I asked Beverly to trace the destination of the automated sweep. I needed the exact routing numbers and the name of the beneficiary institution. I needed to know the name of the monster. Beverly typed a new string of commands. The banking network communicated with external servers for a long and tense moment. Finally, the destination data appeared on the bright monitor. The stolen funds were being routed to a commercial banking institution located on the East Coast. The receiving account was categorized as a corporate holding account. The beneficiary was a limited liability company. The registered name of the entity stared back at me from the screen. L Prime Holdings. I stared at that letter L. L Prime Holdings. Lauren had named the shell company after herself. I let out a dry and humorless chuckle. It was the ultimate display of arrogant hubris. She was so completely convinced of her own superiority that she did not even bother to use a complex pseudonym or a random string of numbers. She honestly believed that I was nothing more than a pathetic and broken old man. She thought my brain was rotting away and that I would never possess the mental capacity to walk into a bank and demand an audit. She thought her proximity to my son made her entirely untouchable. Beverly asked me if I wanted to freeze the transfers immediately. She told me she could flag the account for severe fraudulent activity and call the local authorities. I raised my hand and gently told her to stop. I instructed her to leave the automated sweep perfectly intact. I explained that if we cut off the money supply right now, the thief would immediately know they had been discovered. They would panic, and they would destroy the remaining evidence. They would use their massive wealth and their expensive lawyers to bury the truth and manipulate my son before I could present my case. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my small blue notepad. I carefully wrote down the name L Prime Holdings. I copied the exact 9-digit routing number. I wrote down the receiving commercial account number. I documented the specific dates of the transfers and the total sum of the stolen wealth. My handwriting was crisp and perfectly legible. The tremor in my hands was completely gone. I thanked Beverly for her absolute discretion. I told her she had just handed me the key to my own freedom. I stood up from the comfortable leather chair and placed the notepad safely back into my heavy wool coat. I walked out of the bank manager office and stepped back out into the freezing city streets. The cold wind bit at my face, but I felt a burning fire inside my chest. I had the mechanics of the theft. I had the paper trail. Now I needed to find out exactly what L Prime Holdings was doing with my stolen money. The auditor had awoken, and the investigation was only just beginning. The Chicago Public Library has always been a quiet sanctuary for me. The heavy stone architecture and the silent rows of towering bookshelves offer a profound sense of peace. I walked through the grand entrance and brushed the melting snow off my heavy wool overcoat. I did not stop to admire the vaulted ceilings or the historic paintings. I walked with absolute purpose toward the public computer terminals in the back of the reference section. I found an empty station tucked away in a quiet corner. I pulled out my reading glasses and sat down in the stiff plastic chair. The keyboard was worn smooth by thousands of hands, and the internet connection was painfully slow, but none of that mattered to me. I had the name of a shell company and a routing number. For a man who spent his entire adult life exposing corporate fraud, that was more than enough ammunition to start a war. I logged into the public portal for state business registries. The national database allows anyone with patience and a basic understanding of corporate structuring to peel back the layers of limited liability companies. I typed the letters L Prime Holdings into the search bar and pressed the Enter key. The screen churned for a few long seconds before a list of registered entities appeared. There were several companies with similar names, but I cross-referenced the state of incorporation with the routing data I had gathered from Beverly at the bank. The search narrowed down to a single corporate entity registered in the state of Florida. I clicked on the public filing documents. As an auditor, I know that criminals often try to hide behind registered agents and proxy directors. But Lauren was blindingly arrogant. She had utilized a cheap online legal service to establish the company. The incorporation documents loaded on my bright monitor, and there it was in plain black and white. The managing director of L Prime Holdings was listed as Lauren. Her signature was right there on the digital PDF file. She had total and exclusive control over the account that was bleeding my trust fund dry. But holding companies do not just sit on stolen cash. They filter it. They wash it through assets to make the money look legitimate. I needed to know exactly where my $93,600 a year was going. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to the county property appraiser website for Southern Florida. If L Prime Holdings was moving that much capital, they were likely funneling it into real estate. I searched the company name in the property owner database. The result popped up instantly. L Prime Holdings was the registered owner of a massive residential property in Miami. I copied the address and pasted it into a satellite mapping application. The screen zoomed in on a spectacular stretch of coastline. My breathing slowed down as I stared at the high-resolution images of the property. It was a sprawling beachfront estate. It featured a pristine white exterior, a massive swimming pool overlooking the ocean, and a private dock. It was a multi-million-dollar compound designed for absolute luxury. I pulled up the public tax records and the recorded mortgage deed. The math aligned perfectly. The monthly mortgage payment, property taxes, and association fees for the Miami estate totaled exactly $7,800. Every single penny that Lauren was siphoning from my survival fund was being funneled directly into this tropical mansion. She was keeping me freezing in a dilapidated Chicago apartment, eating watery canned soup so she could finance a beachfront paradise. But a woman like Lauren did not buy a house like that to leave it empty, and she certainly was not living there since she resided here in the city with my son. Someone else was enjoying the fruits of my stolen dignity. I knew exactly how to find out who was living inside that house. I opened a popular social media platform. I did not have an active profile of my own, but the platform allows you to search public accounts. I typed in the names of Lauren's parents, Anthony and Barbara. I had only met them a handful of times at the wedding and during a few brief holidays. They had always struck me as deeply pretentious people who talked a little too loudly about their supposed wealth and their expensive tastes. Their social media profiles were completely public. They wanted the entire world to see how fabulous their lives were. I clicked on Barbara's page, and a grid of brightly colored photographs flooded my screen. I clicked on the most recent picture uploaded just 2 days ago. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked at the image. It was a photograph of Anthony and Barbara sitting on a sun-drenched balcony. The sparkling blue ocean stretched out perfectly behind them. The white railing of the balcony exactly matched the satellite imagery of the Miami estate, owned by L Prime Holdings. Anthony was wearing an expensive linen shirt and holding a crystal flute of champagne. Barbara was smiling broadly, wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat and oversized designer sunglasses. It was the caption beneath the photograph that truly made my blood run cold. Barbara had written a long paragraph celebrating their retirement. She wrote about how wonderful it felt to finally relax after decades of hard work. She typed out the words self-made and blessed. She explicitly thanked her wonderful daughter Lauren for helping them find their dream forever home. The post was flooded with comments from their friends praising their success and admiring their beautiful beachfront lifestyle. I sat completely frozen in the quiet library, staring at the bright screen. The sheer magnitude of the disrespect hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They were not self-made. They were not blessed by hard work. They were living like absolute royalty on money that was meant to keep me alive. They were drinking expensive champagne and soaking up the tropical sun while I was putting on 2 heavy sweaters just to stop my hands from shaking in the winter cold. Lauren was literally stealing food from my mouth to fund her parents' vanity. I thought about my beautiful wife, Diane. I thought about the day we sat together at our kitchen table and made the agonizing decision to sell the home we loved. I thought about the grueling late nights I spent auditing fraudulent ledgers until my eyes burned, just to make sure Jared could finish college without a mountain of debt. I gave up my comfort, my security, and my entire future to build my son into the man he is today. Jared had tried to repay that sacrifice by setting up a trust fund to protect me in my final years, and Lauren had intercepted it. She had hijacked my son's gratitude and redirected it to her own arrogant parents. Anthony and Barbara were playing the role of wealthy retirees using the very money I had earned through a lifetime of quiet sacrifice. It was not just a financial crime. It was a profound and unforgivable insult to my entire existence. It was a mockery of everything Diane and I had built. I felt a tight, burning knot form in the center of my throat. It was not sorrow. It was the purest, most concentrated anger I had ever experienced in my 72 years of life. I did not want to simply stop the automated bank transfers anymore. I did not just want my money back. I wanted to tear down their entire facade. I wanted to rip away the designer clothes, the champagne glasses, and the beachfront estate. I wanted Anthony and Barbara to feel the exact same freezing, desperate humiliation that they had unknowingly forced upon me. I carefully wrote down the Miami address in my blue notepad. I documented the names of the social media accounts and wrote out the exact details of the mortgage payments. I had completely unraveled the mystery of L Prime Holdings. The entire architecture of their theft was now laid bare in front of me. I closed the web browser and cleared the search history on the public terminal. I pushed my chair back and stood up. My knees popped, but I felt taller than I had in a decade. I buttoned my heavy wool overcoat and walked out of the library, back into the punishing Chicago wind. I knew that Lauren was going to notice my absence soon. A predator always keeps a close eye on their prey. She would start asking questions. She would try to tighten the leash. I needed to prepare myself for her counterattack, because the moment she realized I was not a broken old man with a rotting brain, she would do everything in her power to destroy me permanently. I lowered my head against the biting wind and began the long walk back to my crumbling apartment, ready to play my part in her downfall. A predator is always at its most dangerous when it first realizes it has become the hunted. For the first few days following my visit to the bank and the public library, I returned to my freezing apartment and resumed my daily routine. I wore my faded sweaters. I walked to the church food pantry. I shuffled my feet and kept my head bowed low whenever I stepped outside. But the illusion I had carefully maintained for months was already beginning to fracture in the eyes of my daughter-in-law. Lauren had built her entire scheme on the absolute certainty that I was a decaying and invisible old man. She expected me to rot quietly in my chair. But she was highly observant, and she soon noticed the subtle irregularities in my behavior. It started with the phone calls. She would call the cheap landline in my apartment during the middle of the day just to check if I was sitting exactly where she had left me. When I did not answer because I was sitting in the library unraveling her web of shell companies, her suspicion began to slowly curdle into genuine paranoia. She started driving past my crumbling brick building in her expensive luxury sport utility vehicle. She would park across the street and watch my dark windows, waiting for a silhouette to appear. When she realized I was leaving the apartment for hours at a time, the cold reality of the situation began to set in. A man suffering from severe dementia does not take long, calculated trips across the city with a completely focused demeanor. Lauren did not confront me directly. Confrontation requires a level of raw courage that she simply did not possess. Instead, she used the weapon she was most comfortable with. She used my own stolen money to hire a private investigator. I did not know it at the very beginning, but I soon felt the unmistakable weight of someone watching me. When you spend 4 decades conducting high-level corporate audits, you develop a profound sixth sense for surveillance. You notice the same dark sedan parked near the church food pantry. You notice the man in the heavy coat reading a newspaper on the bench directly outside the commercial bank branch. I knew I was being followed, but I did not change my routine. I wanted her investigator to take photographs. I wanted Lauren to see exactly where I was going, because true panic makes a criminal incredibly sloppy. The private investigator was a professional who worked efficiently and quietly. Within 3 days, he had compiled a comprehensive dossier on my movements. He presented the heavy manila folder to Lauren during a secret meeting, while my son Jared was busy running his software empire. I can only imagine the sheer terror that washed over her face as she opened that folder and looked at the glossy photographs. She expected to see pictures of a confused old man wandering aimlessly through public parks or getting lost in the grocery store. What she saw instead was her absolute worst nightmare, completely materialized in high resolution. The first photograph showed me walking through the heavy glass doors of the commercial bank. The second photograph captured me sitting inside the glass-enclosed office of Beverly, the branch manager. The investigator had noted the duration of the meeting. I was inside that office for nearly an hour. The third and fourth photographs documented my trip to the public library. The investigator noted that I did not browse the fiction aisles or read the daily newspapers. He reported that I sat at a reference computer for hours, navigating complex state business registries and property appraisal databases. Lauren was an arrogant woman, but she was not entirely stupid. Looking at those photographs, the pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped into place. She remembered the career I had before my wife Diane passed away. She remembered that Jared had mentioned his father used to audit massive corporate ledgers and track hidden financial assets. The crushing realization hit her with the force of a freight train. I was not losing my mind. I was not suffering from paranoia or severe dementia. I was actively building a forensic case against her. I was mapping out the exact coordinates of L Prime Holdings and tracing the stolen trust fund money directly to the beachfront estate in Miami, where her parents were currently drinking expensive champagne. Panic is a powerful catalyst. When a thief realizes the walls are closing in, they do not simply surrender and apologize. They double down and try to eliminate the threat entirely. Lauren knew that if I managed to sit down with Jared and show him the routing numbers, her luxurious life would be instantly terminated. She would lose the designer coats, the high society galas, and the endless supply of stolen cash. More importantly, Jared would see her for the manipulative predator she truly was. She knew she could not simply kill me without drawing an enormous amount of police attention. But she needed to neutralize me completely and permanently before I could speak to my son. She began frantically searching for a legal mechanism to silence me. She realized that the only way to invalidate the financial evidence I was gathering was to completely destroy my credibility as a sane and rational human being. If a court of law declared me mentally incompetent, any documentation or routing numbers I presented to Jared could easily be dismissed as the paranoid delusions of a sick old man. She needed to strip away my autonomy and trap me in a legal cage where my voice simply would not matter anymore. Lauren contacted a notoriously aggressive attorney who specialized in expedited medical conservatorships. She fed him the same venomous lies she had told Jared. She claimed I was becoming violent and dangerously unpredictable. She insisted that my trips to the bank and the library were signs of severe financial paranoia and that I was a massive threat to my own safety. She demanded that the lawyer draft a medical power of attorney immediately. She intended to use the document as a legal weapon to seize total control over my healthcare decisions and forcefully commit me to a locked psychiatric ward. She planned to corner me in my own apartment and force me to sign away my freedom. She thought the presence of a ruthless attorney and the threat of total starvation would be enough to break my spirit. She believed that my fear of dying alone in a state-run facility would compel me to surrender the evidence and submit to her authority. Lauren was preparing to deliver a preemptive strike that would absolutely devastate my life. She was arming a legal trap designed to erase me from society forever. But as she finalized her malicious paperwork and prepared to ambush me in my freezing home, she remained entirely blind to her own vulnerability. She was so consumed by her desperate need to neutralize me that she failed to realize I was already 10 steps ahead of her. She was marching proudly onto a battlefield that I had carefully designed. She thought she was bringing a legal weapon to destroy an old man, but she was actually walking directly into the jaws of a trap I had patiently set. The final confrontation was rapidly approaching, and I was more than ready to welcome her to the slaughter. The knock on my door came just after 3 in the afternoon. It was not a polite or hesitant tapping. It was 4 sharp and heavy strikes against the peeling wood. I was sitting at my kitchen table drinking a cup of hot water with lemon just to keep my hands from freezing. I slowly stood up and shuffled across the warped linoleum floor. I made sure to let my shoulders slump and my breathing sound labored. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Lauren stood in the dimly lit hallway. She was wearing a tailored black wool coat and a pair of dark leather gloves. Her expression was completely devoid of the fake pity she usually wore when my son was around. But she was not alone. Standing right beside her was a man I had never seen before. He was tall and noticeably thin, with slicked-back graying hair. He wore a gray suit that was trying very hard to look expensive, but the fabric hung awkwardly on his frame. He clutched a thick leather briefcase in his right hand. He had the unmistakable look of a man who made his living by exploiting the vulnerable. Lauren did not ask for permission to enter. She simply pushed past me, stepping into my freezing apartment, as if she owned the entire building. The man in the gray suit followed closely behind her. He wrinkled his nose in obvious disgust as he looked at the water stains on my ceiling and the rusted radiator in the corner. I closed the door slowly, keeping my eyes cast downward. I played the part of the confused and intimidated old man perfectly. Lauren turned to face me. She did not bother to take off her leather gloves. She reached into her deep coat pocket and pulled out her mobile phone. She tapped the screen a few times and placed the device on my small kitchen table. She pressed the speaker button. The dial tone echoed loudly in the quiet room. After 3 rings, my son Jared answered. His voice sounded incredibly tired and heavy with corporate stress. Lauren immediately changed her entire posture. Her shoulders dropped and her face softened into a mask of pure tragedy. She let out a small and theatrical sigh before she spoke. "Jared, honey," she said, her voice trembling, with perfectly manufactured concern. "I am here at your father's apartment. I did not want to worry you while you were at the office, but things have gotten so much worse today. I came to check on him and he barely recognized me. I is completely disoriented, and the living conditions here are becoming a severe hazard to his safety." I listened to my son let out a long and painful breath on the other end of the line. I could hear the background noise of his busy office. "Lauren, honey," he replied, his voice thick with guilt. "What are we supposed to do? He refuses to go back to the facility. I cannot force him into a car." Lauren wiped away a fake tear that did not exist. "I know, Jared," she whispered softly. "That is exactly why I brought Mr. Pierce with me today. He is a highly respected attorney who specializes in elder care and family protection. We just want to get some basic paperwork finalized. It is a medical power of attorney. It will just allow us to make emergency healthcare decisions for him if his mind completely fails. It is just a safety net, Jared, to make sure he does not accidentally hurt himself or wander out into the freezing snow again." There was a heavy silence on the phone. I knew my son was wrestling with the immense guilt of his wealth and his absence. He loved me, but he was entirely blinded by the web of lies his wife had spun around him. Finally, Jared spoke. "Dad. Dad," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Are you there?" I leaned closer to the phone. I made sure my voice sounded incredibly fragile and weak. "I am here, son," I replied softly. "Dad, you need to listen to Lauren," Jared told me. "She is just trying to protect you. We all are. Please, just cooperate with the lawyer so we can get you the medical help you need. I am so sorry I cannot be there today, but I love you. Just sign the papers so you can be safe." I told him that I understood. I told him that I loved him too. Jared hung up the phone. The digital beep signaled the end of the call and the abrupt end of Lauren's performance. The very second the phone screen went dark, the atmosphere in my apartment turned completely toxic. Lauren snatched her phone off the table and dropped it back into her coat pocket. The sweet and sorrowful tone in her voice vanished instantly. It was replaced by a cold and absolute malice. She looked at the man in the gray suit and gave him a short nod. Mr. Pierce stepped forward and placed his heavy leather briefcase on my kitchen table. He unlatched the brass locks and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He laid them out flat and placed a black pen right beside them. He looked at me with cold and empty eyes. "Mr. Blake," he said, his voice smooth and incredibly condescending. "My name is Arthur Pierce. I represent your daughter-in-law. The document in front of you grants her total and exclusive control over your medical and residential decisions. It transfers all legal authority regarding your physical well-being directly into her hands." I looked at the stack of papers, and then I looked at Lauren. She took a step closer to me, invading my personal space. She wanted me to feel trapped. She wanted me to feel like a cornered animal with absolutely no avenue of escape. This was no longer a negotiation. It was a hostage situation happening inside my own home. "You are going to sign every single page," she whispered, her voice dripping with venom. "You are going to sign your name on the dotted line right now. You are going to hand over the last tiny shred of your pathetic independence." I kept my hands trembling slightly by my sides. I looked up at her and asked her what would happen if I refused to sign the paperwork. Lauren let out a cruel and humorless laugh. She leaned in so close that I could smell the strong mint on her breath. "If you refuse to sign," she hissed, "I will call the city authorities right now. I will tell them you are suffering from a violent psychotic break. I will show them this freezing, miserable apartment and tell them you are a severe danger to yourself and the public. They will drag you out of here in a straitjacket. You will not go to a nice retirement home. You will go to a state-funded psychiatric ward. You will be heavily sedated, locked in a sterile room, and completely forgotten by the entire world. Jared will believe every single word I say because he already thinks your brain is rotting away. Mr. Pierce crossed his arms over his chest and nodded in agreement. The court will process the involuntary commitment by tomorrow morning, Mr. Pierce added smoothly. You have absolutely no legal standing to fight this. You have no resources and no credibility. Signing this document is the only way you get to keep sleeping in your own bed tonight. They had orchestrated the perfect corner. They used my son's love and guilt as a weapon to isolate me. They brought a corrupt lawyer to give their extortion a clean and official appearance. They threatened me with the absolute loss of my basic human rights. Lauren stood there looking at me with pure and victorious arrogance. She truly believed she had orchestrated a flawless checkmate. She thought she had effectively silenced the only person who could expose her massive financial theft. I stared down at the black pen resting on the table. The freezing wind rattled the thin glass of my living room window. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was rushing the execution of her plan because she knew I had visited the bank. She was desperate to neutralize me before I could analyze the routing numbers and the shell company data. She needed to legally bind me and strip away my voice. I slowly reached out my trembling hand and picked up the black pen. I let out a long and ragged breath, playing the part of a man who had finally been broken by fear. I looked at the first page of the dense legal document. I knew that I had to read every single word very carefully. I knew that in the world of corporate auditing, the devil is always hiding in the fine print. Lauren and her sleazy lawyer thought they were handing me my own death warrant. They had absolutely no idea that they were inviting a veteran auditor to review their sloppy paperwork. I did not rush and hang heavy in the freezing room, allowing Lauren to believe that she had completely paralyzed me with fear. I slowly slid the black pen across the chipped linoleum table. I picked it up with a deliberate tremor in my fingers. I looked at Mr. Pierce and asked him if he had personally drafted this document. He smiled a thin, greasy smile and confirmed that he had customized it specifically for my situation. That was all the confirmation I needed to know that the paperwork in front of me was a rush job born out of panic and desperation. Lauren slammed her hands flat on the table, leaning over the documents. She was losing her patience. "Sign it, old man," she hissed. "Do not test me today. I can make a phone call right now and completely cut off the $200 a month you get from the trust. You will not be able to buy soup. You will not be able to pay the electric bill. I will starve you out of this apartment before the state even arrives with the straitjacket. Sign the paper." I nodded slowly, keeping my head bowed in a posture of total defeat. I told her that I would sign, but that I needed to read it first to understand exactly what I was agreeing to. I knew she could not deny me that simple request in front of a lawyer, even a corrupt one. Lauren rolled her eyes dramatically and crossed her arms, pacing the small kitchen while her heels clicked sharply against the floor. Mr. Pierce simply checked his watch, clearly annoyed by the delay. I adjusted my reading glasses and began to scan the dense legal text. To an untrained eye, the document looked like an impenetrable wall of legal jargon. But to an auditor who spent 40 years dismantling complex corporate contracts, it was no more than a poorly constructed puzzle. I read through the standard clauses granting medical authority. I read through the sections assigning residential control. And then, halfway down page 3, hidden deep within a convoluted paragraph regarding the transfer of fiduciary responsibilities, I found the fatal flaw. It was a standard boilerplate clause that a lazy attorney had likely copied and pasted from a previous corporate trust template without fully understanding its implications. The clause stated that before the medical power of attorney could be fully executed and recognized as legally binding, a comprehensive forensic audit of all associated family trusts must be automatically initiated and completed by the primary fiduciary accounting firm. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my breathing perfectly steady. Mr. Pierce had fundamentally misunderstood the structure of Jared's wealth. Jared did not use a small local accountant for his personal trusts. He used the massive corporate accounting firm that handled his software empire. By forcing me to sign this document, Lauren was not silencing me. She was legally triggering a massive corporate audit into her own shell companies. She was legally ordering Jared's most ruthless accountants to tear apart the financial architecture of L Prime Holdings. I read the clause a second time just to ensure I was not hallucinating. It was flawless. The trap was set and armed by her own attorney. Lauren thought she was binding my hands, but she was actually handing me the detonator to her entire life. She was completely oblivious to the financial earthquake she was about to unleash. I let out a shaky theatrical breath. I looked up at Lauren, my eyes wide with manufactured fear. I told her that the legal language was too complicated for my old brain to understand. I told her that I was scared and that I just wanted to be safe. I asked her if she promised to let me stay in my apartment if I signed the papers. Lauren stopped pacing. A slow, cruel, and victorious smile spread across her face. She stepped up to the table and looked down at me like I was an insect. "I promise, Oscar," she purred, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "You sign the document, and you get to stay right here in your freezing little apartment." She was lying. I knew she was lying. The moment the ink dried on the paper, she fully intended to lock me away and throw away the key. But she had no idea that the ink on that page would be the absolute end of her reign. I looked back down at the signature line. I positioned the black pen over the paper. The silent adjustment was moving into its final and most devastating phase. I let the black pen hover over the thick white paper. I stared down at the signature line, letting my hand shake just enough to make the movement look pathetic, but not enough to seem theatrical. Lauren tapped her expensive leather shoe against my cracked linoleum floor. Her patience was completely gone. She let out a sharp and irritated sigh, telling me to hurry up. She said she had an important dinner reservation and could not waste her entire afternoon watching a broken old man practice his handwriting. I looked up at her through my reading glasses. I let my lower lip tremble, and I forced a single tear to pool in the corner of my eye. I asked her if she really promised to let me stay in my apartment. I asked her if she promised not to tell Jared that my brain was failing. I needed her to explicitly verbalize her lie one last time in front of the lawyer to fully solidify her malicious intent. Lauren leaned over the table. She smiled a terrible and victorious smile. "I promise, Oscar," she whispered, her voice dripping with fake sweetness and real venom. "You just sign that paper, and you get to stay right here in your freezing little home." Mr. Pierce checked his heavy silver watch again, looking supremely bored by the entire interaction. He clearly did not care about the ethics of the situation. He only cared about his exorbitant hourly rate. I lowered my head, accepting my supposed defeat. I pressed the tip of the pen against the paper. I slowly and carefully signed my full legal name on the dotted line. I made sure my signature looked messy and unsteady, completing the illusion of a man who was rapidly losing his physical and mental faculties. I slid the document across the table. Mr. Pierce snatched it up immediately. He quickly verified the signature and then pulled out his notary stamp. He stamped the document twice, pressing down hard to make it absolutely official. He placed the paperwork into his heavy leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. The transaction was complete. Lauren took a step back from the table. The fake sweetness vanished from her face instantly. She looked down at me with absolute and naked disgust. "You really are pathetic," she spat out. "I cannot believe Jared actually worries about you. You are nothing but a burden. You are lucky I am willing to manage your miserable little existence." She turned on her expensive heel and walked toward the door. Mr. Pierce followed closely behind her, eager to escape the depressing reality of my apartment. Lauren paused with her hand on the doorknob. She looked back at me one last time. "Do not ever try to leave this apartment again," she commanded sharply. "Do not go to the bank. Do not go to the library. If I find out you have been wandering around the city, I will call the hospital immediately. You belong here, Oscar. Do not forget it." She opened the door and walked out into the freezing hallway. Mr. Pierce followed her and pulled the heavy door shut behind them. The metal latch clicked, locking me inside. I listened to their footsteps fading down the corridor. I listened until I heard the distant thud of the main building door closing behind them. The second. The building went totally silent. My entire posture changed. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. The fake tear dried up. I straightened my back, pushing away the heavy facade of the defeated old man. I walked over to the kitchen sink and splashed cold water on my face, washing away the physical tension of the performance. Lauren had walked into my home believing she was holding an executioner's axe. She thought she had effectively stripped me of my autonomy and silenced my voice permanently. She believed that document gave her total control over my medical destiny and, by extension, my financial records. She had no idea that the document she just forced me to sign was actually a detonator. Jared's corporate accountants were notoriously ruthless and meticulous. They handled multi-million-dollar software portfolios. They did not miss a single discrepancy. By legally registering that specific power of attorney, Mr. Pierce had automatically triggered the forensic audit clause hidden deep within the paperwork. The moment that document was filed into the corporate trust system, the automated failsafe would engage. A team of elite forensic accountants would immediately begin a mandatory and comprehensive review of every single transfer moving in and out of my family trust account. They would track the automated sweep. They would find L Prime Holdings. They would trace the missing $96,000 a year directly to the beachfront estate in Miami. And they would hand that devastating report directly to my son. I walked over to my small living room window and looked out at the freezing Chicago street below. I watched Lauren and Mr. Pierce walk toward her luxury sport utility vehicle. She was smiling broadly, talking animatedly to her sleazy lawyer. She felt entirely victorious. She felt invincible. I watched her sleek black car pull away from the curb and disappear into the city traffic. I smiled for the first time in days. A cold and calculating smile. The trap was armed. The timer was officially counting down. I did not need to scream or fight or argue with her anymore. I just needed to sit back in the shadows and wait for the massive financial explosion to tear her entire empire to the ground. The silent adjustment was moving perfectly into place. Tuesday morning arrived with a pale and watery sun, struggling to break through the thick winter clouds. I sat at my small kitchen table looking out the frosted window. I did not need a clock to know exactly what was happening in the financial district of downtown Chicago. I had spent 40 years in those towering glass skyscrapers. I knew the precise rhythm of a corporate legal department. I knew that at 9 in the morning, a courier hired by Mr. Pierce was walking through a set of revolving doors. He was carrying a sealed manila envelope containing the notarized medical power of attorney. He was delivering my supposed surrender directly into the hands of my son's corporate legal team. Jared was a brilliant software engineer, but he was also a man who appreciated extreme efficiency. When his company went public, he integrated his personal family trusts into the massive automated architecture of his corporate holding firm. He wanted everything streamlined and perfectly secure. I knew this because I was the one who taught him to protect his assets. I taught him to never leave a single financial door unlocked. Jared built a system that operated on cold and unfeeling logic. He programmed automated safeguards to protect the family wealth from external threats. But the system was completely blind to who the threat was. It simply followed its core programming. When the legal receptionist opened that envelope and scanned the power of attorney into the secure network, she believed she was just filing standard medical paperwork. She filed the document under my name and linked it to my primary family trust. She had absolutely no idea she was stepping on a digital landmine. The moment the document was uploaded and the system registered a transfer of fiduciary control, the automated safety protocols engaged immediately. The system recognized that a new individual was attempting to take legal authority over a protected financial beneficiary. I took a slow sip of my hot lemon water. I could almost hear the silent digital alarm bells ringing miles away. The system instantly locked the external transfer capabilities of the trust. It generated a high-priority alert and routed it directly to the internal forensic accounting division. In the world of high-level wealth management, you cannot simply transfer legal control of a beneficiary without establishing a flawless financial baseline. The corporate accountants were mandated by their own strict compliance laws to conduct a comprehensive audit of the trust before the power of attorney could be officially activated. They had to ensure there were no existing liabilities. I closed my eyes and visualized the young and ambitious corporate accountant who was assigned to my file. He probably sighed when the alert popped up on his bright dual monitors. He probably thought he was going to spend a boring Tuesday morning reviewing a simple retirement fund for an old man. He opened the digital ledger expecting to see mundane expenses like grocery bills and pharmacy co-payments. Instead, he was greeted by a massive and glaring financial anomaly. The accountant looked at the incoming deposits of $8,000. That part was perfectly normal. But then his eyes moved to the secondary column. He saw the automated sweep. He saw $7,800 vanishing into the ether exactly 48 hours after it arrived. A novice might think it was a planned investment transfer, but a forensic accountant trained by one of the top firms in the country would immediately recognize the unmistakable footprint of an aggressive diversion tactic. The sheer velocity of the automated withdrawal was a massive red flag. I knew exactly what that accountant was doing in that very moment. He stopped drinking his morning coffee. He leaned closer to his screen. He traced the outgoing wire transfer, identifying the receiving institution on the East Coast. He requested the beneficiary data, and the name L Prime Holdings flashed across his monitor. Any standard corporate auditor knows that legitimate family medical expenses are not routed through limited liability shell companies in a different state. The accountant tried to pull the registration data for the holding company and hit a solid brick wall of Florida property records. The anomaly was no longer just a suspicious transaction. It was a textbook case of severe financial embezzlement. The accountant knew he had just uncovered a massive theft directly impacting the family of the chief executive officer. He could not just send a quick email to Jared. Corporate protocol in a situation this explosive is incredibly rigid. He immediately escalated the file to his senior manager. The senior manager reviewed the routing numbers and escalated the file to the managing partner of the firm. They had to verify every single data point before they presented this absolute disaster to my son. They were gathering a team to rip apart the financial history of L Prime Holdings. They were pulling property tax records and finding the beachfront estate in Miami. They were discovering that the wife of their boss was systematically robbing her elderly father-in-law. They were building an airtight and devastating dossier of evidence. And the most beautiful part of this entire process was that it was all happening in complete and absolute secrecy. The accounting firm would not alert Lauren. They would quietly build the bomb that would destroy her life. Lauren was completely oblivious to the massive storm gathering over her head. She was likely sitting in a luxury cafe, sipping an expensive latte, and bragging to her friends about her upcoming high society charity gala. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully silenced me and secured her stolen fortune forever. She had no idea that her own malicious paperwork had triggered the very mechanism that was currently dismantling her entire empire. I sat in my freezing apartment, feeling a profound and deeply satisfying peace. I did not need to make a single phone call. I did not need to hire my own expensive lawyers to fight her in a courtroom. I had simply used her own arrogant momentum against her. I let her walk blindly into a corporate trap designed by my own son. The dominoes were finally falling, and they were falling exactly as I had calculated. I just had to wait patiently in the shadows until the final piece dropped into place. The final confrontation was inevitable, and I was entirely prepared for the fallout. While the forensic accountants were quietly dismantling her shell company behind tightly closed doors, Lauren was busy putting on the most expensive performance of her life. Jared's software company had just reached a massive milestone. The firm was officially going public, and the initial public offering was set to make him a billionaire. For a man like my son, it was the culmination of 2 decades of relentless work and sleepless nights. For Lauren, it was the ultimate opportunity to crown herself the queen of high society. She took complete control of the celebration. She decided to host a lavish charity gala at the most exclusive grand ballroom in the city. It was an event designed to disguise her massive ego as philanthropy. She wanted to prove to the world that she belonged among the elite, and she was using my son's hard-earned money to buy her way into that circle. She invited hundreds of investors, local politicians, and media personalities. She wanted the cameras flashing and the journalists writing about her flawless taste. And of course, she flew her parents up from their stolen beachfront estate in Miami. Anthony and Barbara arrived in Chicago ready to parade around the ballroom and play the role of the wealthy, successful in-laws. They were preparing to drink expensive champagne and accept the congratulations of the city elite, all while I sat in my freezing apartment, eating the food I carried home from the church pantry. The absolute arrogance of her plan was almost breathtaking. She truly believed she was completely untouchable. She thought she had erased the only threat to her fraudulent empire. But a public event of that magnitude presented a significant problem for her perfect image. She could not risk having her husband bring his elderly father to the gala. She knew that if I stood in front of Jared and spoke clearly, the entire illusion of my failing mind would shatter in front of hundreds of witnesses. She needed me completely erased from the narrative. So she spun her final and most cruel lie. I knew exactly how she did it because my son called me the day before the gala, and his voice was heavy with a sorrow that he did not deserve to carry. The phone rang on my small kitchen table. When I answered, Jared spoke in a low and hesitant tone. He told me that Lauren had successfully finalized the medical paperwork. He said she had quietly moved me into a highly specialized private care facility just outside the city limits. He told me that Lauren said I was resting comfortably, but that my mind was far too fragile for visitors. She had convinced my own son that bringing me to a crowded and noisy ballroom would trigger a severe and violent panic attack. She painted herself as the ultimate martyr, making the difficult medical decisions to protect a broken old man. She told him that keeping me away from the gala was an act of profound mercy. I listened to my son apologize to me over the phone. He told me how much he loved me and how much he wished I could be there to see his company go public. He said he was dedicating his opening speech to the sacrifices I made for him after his mother passed away. The heartbreak in his voice was genuine, and it took every ounce of my willpower not to break character. I wanted to tell him that I was sitting exactly where I had been for 3 years. I wanted to tell him that his wife was a parasite bleeding us both dry. But I kept my voice weak and confused. I told him I was proud of him, and I told him to enjoy his big night. I knew that if I revealed the truth over the phone, Lauren would find a way to twist the narrative and portray me as a delusional old man having a manic episode. I had to let the lie stand for just a little while longer. Lauren was reveling in her stolen wealth and her societal status. The local newspapers published glowing articles about her philanthropic efforts leading up to the event. I saw the morning paper lying on a bench during my walk to the church pantry. There was a large photograph of her trying on custom designer gowns that cost more than my entire annual pension. She was giving interviews about how important family values were to her and her husband. She talked extensively about the importance of giving back to the less fortunate and caring for the elderly. The profound hypocrisy of her public statements made my empty stomach turn. She was smiling for the cameras and accepting praise for her charity, while systematically stealing $96,000 a year from the man who gave her husband everything. She was a master of public relations, using her charm to blind everyone around her. She thought the signed medical document had safely locked me away in a metaphorical cage. She assumed I was sitting in the dark, waiting for my inevitable end. She believed she had successfully isolated me from the only person who mattered. By convincing Jared that I was locked away in a medical facility, she ensured that he would not come looking for me at my crumbling apartment. She had effectively built a fortress of lies around her luxurious life. She felt so safe and so superior that she did not even bother to check if her automated bank sweeps were still functioning. She was entirely blinded by the bright lights of her upcoming party and the intoxicating allure of extreme wealth. I sat by my frosted window and watched the evening snow begin to fall over the city streets. I did not feel sad or abandoned. I felt a cold and precise sense of purpose. Lauren had orchestrated a magnificent stage for her own destruction. She wanted a massive audience. She wanted all the major investors and the local media to be gathered in one single room. She wanted the spotlight to shine directly on her perfectly contoured face. She had spent months trying to make me invisible, but she had unwittingly provided me with the greatest platform I could have ever asked for. She was setting up a spectacular venue for her own devastating downfall. The charity gala was scheduled for Saturday night. It was supposed to be the crowning achievement of her social climbing career. She was preparing to walk down a grand staircase dripping in stolen luxury. She had absolutely no idea that the corporate accountants had already finalized their forensic review of L Prime Holdings. She did not know that the trap she had forced me to sign was already snapping shut around her ankles. She thought she was preparing for a coronation, but she was actually dressing up for her own public execution. I took a slow sip of my hot water. Let her celebrate, I thought to myself. Let her enjoy the expensive wine and the flashing cameras. Let her parents toast to their fake success, because tomorrow night, the invisible old man was going to step out of the shadows and tear her beautiful world into pieces. The auditor was finally ready to deliver the final report. The charity gala was an absolute fortress. I knew Lauren had hired elite private security to manage the guest list. She wanted to ensure that only the wealthiest investors and the most prominent politicians crossed the threshold of that grand ballroom. Anyone without a gold-embossed invitation and a matching government identification would be immediately escorted off the premises by men in dark suits. I could not simply walk up to the front doors and demand to see my son. Lauren had likely given my photograph to the security team with strict instructions to turn away the confused old man if he managed to wander away from his supposed care facility. I also knew that I could not just call Jared on his personal mobile phone. Lauren was a parasite who deeply embedded herself in every single aspect of his life. She routinely intercepted his personal calls and managed his private calendar. If I left a voicemail, she would delete it before he ever saw the notification. If I sent an email, she would intercept the server traffic and block my address. She had built a massive digital wall around my son to keep the truth from reaching him. I needed to bypass her completely. I needed an inside ally who possessed enough corporate authority to breach her defenses and grant me physical access to that ballroom. In my 4 decades as a corporate auditor, I learned that the most powerful person in any massive company is never the chief executive officer. The true power always belongs to the chief financial officer. The person who controls the ledger controls the entire empire. The chief financial officer for the software company of Jared was a man named Wallace. I had met Wallace briefly a few years ago when Jared first took his software company public. Wallace was a rigid and brilliant numbers man who viewed corporate finances as a sacred trust. I was exactly the kind of man who would rather burn his own career to the ground than allow an active embezzlement to infect his balance sheets. I did not call the main corporate switchboard. A seasoned auditor knows how to find direct lines. I used a public terminal at the local library to dig through old corporate filings until I located the direct office extension for the financial department head. Early Wednesday morning, I sat at my small kitchen table and dialed the number on my cheap mobile phone. I waited through 3 long rings before the line clicked open. Wallace answered with a brisk and impatient tone. He stated his name and asked the purpose of the call, assuming I was just another aggressive vendor or a confused shareholder. I did not waste a single second with pleasantries. I spoke with the calm and commanding voice of a senior investigator. I told him my name was Oscar Blake and that I was the father of his chief executive officer. There was a brief silence on the line. Wallace cleared his throat, and his tone softened slightly. He offered his condolences regarding my failing health, obviously repeating the lies that Lauren had planted throughout the corporate office. I cut him off immediately. I told him my mind was perfectly fine, but his corporate ledgers were actively bleeding. I told him to sit down at his terminal and open the internal accounting software. I heard the hesitation in his breath, but the authoritative weight of my voice compelled him to listen. I recited the exact routing number for my family trust account. I told him to look at the automated sweep that executed 48 hours after every deposit. I recited the name L Prime Holdings, and I gave him the commercial receiving account number located in Florida. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy. I could hear the rapid clicking of his mechanical keyboard through the phone speaker. Wallace was pulling the data. I waited patiently while the brilliant financial mind on the other end of the line processed the exact same catastrophic anomaly that I had discovered at the bank. I heard him let out a sharp and ragged breath. I heard him whisper the name of the shell company as the realization hit him like a physical blow. I did not stop there. I told him about the power of attorney document that had been filed the previous morning. I explained that the document was a desperate attempt by Lauren to mask a massive and ongoing theft. I told him that she was siphoning $96,000 a year to pay the mortgage on a beachfront estate for her parents. I gave him the address of the Miami property and told him to cross-reference the holding company registration with the maiden name of Lauren. Wallace was a professional, but I could hear the genuine horror in his voice. He realized that the wife of his boss was systematically robbing an elderly man to fund a lavish, tropical lifestyle. He realized that the corporate trust mechanism he was sworn to protect had been weaponized by a predator. He asked me why I had not gone directly to the police. I explained that the police would freeze the accounts and start a slow, bureaucratic investigation that Lauren would drag out for years with expensive defense attorneys. I told him that my son needed to see the undeniable proof with his own two eyes in a setting where Lauren could not spin her web of emotional lies. I told Wallace that I needed to be inside the grand ballroom on Saturday night. I needed to hand the physical dossier of financial evidence directly to Jared while the entire world was watching. Wallace understood the strategy perfectly. A public execution of her lies was the only way to completely sever her influence over the company and over my son. He told me that Lauren had locked down the guest list with absolute paranoia, but that the chief financial officer possessed a master security clearance credential. Wallace promised to meet me at the service entrance of the venue 30 minutes before Jared was scheduled to give his keynote address. He promised to personally escort me through the service corridors and position me right behind the main ballroom doors. He told me he was currently securing the digital audit files and printing the hard copies I would need to present to Jared. The alliance was forged in cold, hard numbers and a shared hatred for financial predators. I hung up the phone and looked out my frosted window. Lauren thought she had built an impenetrable fortress around her stolen life. She thought her security guards and her digital blocks made her completely untouchable. She had absolutely no idea that I had just recruited the architect of the financial empire of her husband to hold the back door open for me. The trap was fully armed, and my inside man was actively clearing the path to the main stage. The gala was going to be a spectacular event indeed. I knelt on the freezing floor of my bedroom. My joints protested with sharp flares of pain, but I ignored them completely. I reached under the old wooden bed frame and pulled back a loose floorboard. Beneath the dust and the shadows sat a small metal lockbox. It contained the absolute last of my personal emergency cash. I had saved those bills over the course of 3 years by eating smaller portions and sitting in the dark to save electricity. It was money meant for a catastrophic medical emergency or a sudden eviction. I opened the box and counted the crisp bills. There was exactly $1,200. For a man living on church pantry soup, that amount of money was a fortune. It could have bought me months of reliable groceries and a brand new space heater. It could have bought me physical comfort. But physical comfort was no longer my primary objective. I did not need a new heater. I needed armor. I took the entire stack of bills and placed them securely into the inner pocket of my heavy wool overcoat. I left my apartment and walked out into the punishing Chicago winter. The wind tried to push me back, but my stride was longer and much more deliberate than it had been in years. I walked directly past the grocery store with its brightly lit windows displaying fresh produce and hot meals. My stomach growled fiercely, reminding me that I had eaten nothing but dry toast since yesterday morning. I silenced my hunger with pure willpower. I was feeding something much larger than my empty stomach. I was feeding my dignity. I took a bus to the upscale commercial district. I avoided the modern department stores with their loud music and aggressive salespeople. Instead, I walked down a quiet side street lined with classic brick facades. I stopped in front of a traditional menswear boutique. It was the kind of establishment that had been tailoring garments for successful businessmen and local politicians for decades. The display window featured dark, rich fabrics and polished leather shoes. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside. The shop smelled of steam-pressed wool, leather polish, and measuring chalk. It was a scent that instantly transported me back 20 years to the prime of my auditing career. An older salesman approached me. His eyes quickly scanned my faded sweater and my worn-out shoes. He opened his mouth to politely inform me that I was likely in the wrong store. Before he could speak a single word of condescension, I pulled the thick stack of bills from my overcoat and set it down on the glass display counter. I looked him directly in the eyes with the piercing and unyielding gaze of a senior corporate auditor. I told him I needed a suit. I told him I needed a dark, charcoal gray two-piece suit tailored to fit my frame perfectly by Saturday afternoon. I told him the price was absolutely not an object, but the craftsmanship had to be entirely flawless. The salesman looked at the cash and then looked back at my face. He recognized the firm tone of my voice. It was the tone of a man who was used to giving orders and expecting immediate compliance. He nodded respectfully and swept away his initial judgment. He escorted me to the back of the shop and called for the master tailor. For the next hour, I stood in front of a three-way mirror while the tailor measured my shoulders, my waist, and my arms. He brought out bolts of premium Italian wool. I selected a dark charcoal fabric that was understated but incredibly powerful. It was not a flashy suit meant to attract cheap attention. It was a serious and commanding garment. It was the uniform of a man who dismantled corporate empires for a living. I stood completely still while the tailor pinned the heavy fabric around my frame. As he worked, I watched my reflection in the tall mirrors. For 3 long years, I had deliberately slouched my shoulders. I had shuffled my feet and kept my head bowed low to play the part of the invisible and helpless old man. I did it because I thought that was what the world expected of me. I did it because Lauren and her sleazy lawyer needed me to be weak and pliable. But looking at the sharp lines of the dark wool draped over my shoulders, the illusion finally shattered. The broken and confused grandfather vanished entirely. The man staring back at me from the mirror was the man who raised a millionaire. He was the man who sold his cherished family home to pay for college tuition. He was the man who sat across from corrupt chief executive officers and forced them to surrender their stolen assets. My spine straightened automatically. My chin lifted. The deep lines on my face no longer looked like signs of decay and exhaustion. They looked like battle scars. They were the geographic map of a man who had survived a lifetime of hardship and still refused to break. I realized in that quiet tailor shop that Lauren had not simply stolen my money. She had attempted to steal my identity. She had tried to convince me that I was nothing more than a pathetic burden. I paid the salesman the required deposit and promised to return on Saturday morning for the final fitting. I walked back out into the freezing city streets without my heavy overcoat buttoned all the way up. The cold air hit my chest, but I felt completely untouchable. I did not feel the pain in my knees or the biting hunger in my stomach. The physical transformation was rapidly fueling a profound mental resurrection. Every step I took away from that tailor shop was a step away from the victim Lauren had created. I spent the next 2 days meticulously preparing for the gala. I did not sit by the window and watch the snowfall. I mentally rehearsed every single detail of the financial dossier. I memorized the routing numbers, the account limits, and the property addresses. I practiced my delivery. I knew that when I walked into that grand ballroom, I could not show a single ounce of hesitation or sorrow. I could not be a grieving father asking for an apology. I had to be an executioner delivering a final and absolute verdict. Saturday morning finally arrived. I returned to the boutique and put on the finished suit. The master tailor had done an exceptional job. The dark charcoal wool fit me perfectly and hid the frailty of my age. I purchased a crisp white dress shirt and a solid dark tie. I bought a pair of polished black leather Oxfords. When I walked out of the dressing room, the salesman gave me a slow and deeply respectful nod. I looked like a man who owned the entire building. I took the garment bag and made my way back to my apartment for the final hours of waiting. I laid the suit out on my small bed. I took a hot shower and shaved my face with absolute precision. I combed my gray hair back neatly. I put on the clothes one piece at a time, deliberately stepping into my armor. The final piece was the heavy manila folder containing the damning audit report, printed by my inside ally. I held it in my hands, feeling the heavy weight of the undeniable evidence. I was no longer Oscar Blake, the starving tenant. I was the auditor, and my final review was complete. The biting winter wind whipped through the narrow service alley behind the grand ballroom, but I did not shiver. I stood perfectly still, hidden within the deep shadows of the towering brick building. I was wearing my newly tailored charcoal suit under my heavy overcoat. The fabric felt like a protective shield. Through the thick glass windows high above me, I could see the golden glow of the grand chandeliers. I could hear the muffled rhythmic thumping of classical music playing for the city elite. A long line of sleek black limousines and luxury vehicles wrapped around the front entrance. Wealthy investors, media personalities, and local politicians were stepping out onto a plush red carpet. They were all arriving to celebrate my son and his massively successful software company. They were also unknowingly arriving to witness the absolute destruction of his wife. I checked my simple wristwatch. It was exactly 8:30 in the evening. Right on schedule, the heavy metal service door at the end of the alley clicked open. A sliver of warm yellow light spilled out onto the frozen pavement. A man in a sharp black tuxedo stepped out into the freezing cold. He looked around nervously, checking both ends of the dark alley. It was Wallace, the chief financial officer of my son's company. I stepped out of the shadows and walked slowly toward him. As I approached, the dim light illuminated my face and my tailored suit. Wallace let out a breath he had clearly been holding. He looked at me with a profound sense of respect. He did not see a fragile old man. He saw a fellow auditor ready to execute a flawless financial takedown. Wallace reached inside his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder. He handed it to me with a solemn nod. The folder was incredibly heavy. It contained the complete forensic audit. It held the irrefutable proof of the automated bank sweeps, the shell company registration, the Florida property deed, and the forged medical power of attorney. Every single piece of paper was officially stamped and verified by the highest-level corporate accountants. I held the dossier in my hands, feeling the raw power contained within those pages. I thanked Wallace quietly. He simply nodded and told me that nobody steals from his company and gets away with it. He turned around and held the heavy metal service door open for me. I stepped out of the freezing Chicago winter and crossed the threshold into the belly of the beast. We walked through a complicated labyrinth of service corridors. The backstage area of the Grand Ballroom was a chaotic blur of caterers carrying silver trays and event staff whispering frantically into their headsets. Nobody paid any attention to us. Wallace walked with the absolute authority of an executive who practically owned the building. When we reached the final security checkpoint blocking the entrance to the main event, a massive man in a dark suit stepped in front of us. He asked to see my gold-embossed invitation and my identification. He was strictly following the paranoid orders of Lauren to keep out any unapproved guests. Wallace did not even break his stride. He pulled out his master corporate security credential and flashed it directly in the face of the guard. He coldly informed the man that I was a majority shareholder conducting a surprise inspection of the event operations. The guard immediately stepped aside and apologized. We walked right past him without looking back. Wallace led me to a set of heavy mahogany double doors at the very back of the main ballroom. He pushed them open just a fraction of an inch, allowing me to slip inside unnoticed. The sensory overload of the room hit me instantly. The air was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements and the exact same sickeningly sweet perfume that Lauren always wore. Thousands of crystal droplets hung from the ceiling, reflecting blinding light across the massive room. Waiters in white gloves floated through the crowd, balancing tall glasses of imported champagne. Hundreds of people in expensive gowns and tailored tuxedos mingled and laughed. It was a monument to extreme wealth and excess. I stood in the deep shadows near the back wall, blending in perfectly with my dark suit. I scanned the massive room until I found her. Lauren was standing near the front stage playing the role of the perfect and gracious hostess. She was wearing a dazzling emerald green gown that swept across the polished floor. She was holding a crystal glass and laughing a fake melodic laugh as she charmed a group of wealthy investors. Right beside her stood her parents, Anthony and Barbara. They looked incredibly smug, dressed in luxury garments that were entirely paid for by my stolen survival funds. They were living a spectacular lie and soaking up the adoration of high society. My grip tightened on the thick manila folder. I watched her revel in her stolen glory, knowing that her entire empire was balancing on a razor-thin wire that I was about to snap. Suddenly, the low murmur of the crowd began to fade. The classical music dropped away completely. A bright spotlight shifted and illuminated the center of the grand stage. The audience turned their attention forward and broke into a thunderous round of applause. My son walked up the steps and took his place behind the clear acrylic podium. Jared looked incredibly handsome and successful, but the heavy bags under his eyes betrayed his deep internal exhaustion. He adjusted the microphone and smiled warmly at the crowd. The room fell into absolute silence, waiting for the young billionaire to speak. Jared took a deep breath and began his keynote address. He did not talk about software codes or profit margins. He talked about legacy. He spoke about the core values that built his company from the ground up. He talked about honesty, integrity, and the importance of taking care of the people who helped you reach the top. My heart ached as I listened to his voice echo through the massive ballroom. He was a good man who had been completely blinded by a predator. Then the tone of his voice shifted. It became softer and incredibly vulnerable. He looked out at the sea of wealthy faces and told them that none of his success would have been possible without the sacrifices of one specific man. He spoke about his father. He told the crowd how I sold our family home after his mother died, just to pay for his college tuition. He praised my decades of hard work as an auditor and my unwavering commitment to the truth. Jared told the entire room that although his father was currently battling a tragic and confusing illness, he was dedicating this monumental night entirely to my honor. A collective sigh of sympathy swept through the wealthy audience. Lauren looked up at her husband and placed her hand over her heart, performing the role of the deeply supportive and grieving wife flawlessly. It was a sickening display of emotional manipulation. She was using my supposed mental decay to elevate her own social standing in front of the city elite. She wiped away a completely fake tear and smiled bravely for the cameras capturing the moment. I knew right then that the time for hiding was completely over. The narrative had to be forcefully corrected. I stepped out of the deep shadows of the back wall. I held my head high and squared my shoulders. I clutched the heavy dossier in my right hand. The infiltration was complete, and the tension in the room had reached its absolute peak. I took my first deliberate step down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, ready to shatter the grand illusion and drag the predator directly into the punishing light. I placed my polished black leather shoes onto the thick red carpet of the main aisle. The grand ballroom was massive and opulent, but every single step I took felt incredibly loud and deliberate to my own ears. I did not rush. I walked with the slow and measured pacing of a man who held the absolute truth securely in his hands. The wealthy investors standing near the heavy wooden doors were the first to notice me. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in sparkling evening gowns began to step aside. They parted like the sea, yielding to a storm, not because they knew who I was, but because my posture commanded an undeniable and absolute authority. I was no longer the fragile old man freezing in a crumbling apartment. I was an executioner walking calmly into my own designated hunting ground. As I moved further down the long center aisle, a low and confused whisper began to ripple rapidly through the audience. Heads turned in my direction. Crystal glasses of champagne were slowly lowered to the tables. The collective attention of the entire room was shifting violently away from the bright stage and focusing completely on the dark figure moving through their ranks. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead. I did not look at the local politicians whispering to their aides. I ignored the media personalities pointing their heavy television cameras toward the sudden disruption. My gaze was fixed with laser precision on the clear acrylic podium where my son was standing. Jared was right in the middle of a heartfelt sentence about family legacy and building a future based on trust. His deep voice was echoing powerfully through the massive speakers hanging from the vaulted ceiling. But as his eyes scanned the crowd, he suddenly froze. The inspiring words completely died in his throat. He leaned forward, gripping the edges of the clear podium so hard, his knuckles turned stark white under the stage lights. He blinked rapidly and shook his head as if he was trying to wake up from a bizarre and impossible hallucination. He expected to see a broken and deeply confused old man who was supposedly locked away in a medical facility. Instead, he was staring at a formidable veteran auditor, wearing a flawless charcoal wool suit. The microphone picked up his sharp and ragged intake of breath, broadcasting his pure shock across the silent ballroom. The sudden and heavy silence from the stage made Lauren turn her head. She had been standing proudly near the front row, soaking up the admiration and envy of the elite crowd. She turned around to see what had distracted her husband from his momentous speech. The very second her eyes landed on my face, her entire physical demeanor collapsed. The perfectly rehearsed smile of the generous philanthropist melted right off her face. All the warm and vibrant color instantly drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a pale and terrified ghost. Her hand began to tremble so violently that the expensive champagne spilled over the rim of her crystal glass and splashed darkly onto her designer emerald gown. She knew exactly what was happening. The nightmare she thought she had legally buried had just walked through the front doors. I continued my steady march and reached the front row of reserved tables. Anthony and Barbara were sitting there completely oblivious to the impending disaster. The parents of Lauren looked at me with expressions of mild annoyance, wondering why an older man was interrupting their glamorous moment in the spotlight. They were wearing clothes paid for by my stolen survival funds. I did not even give them the satisfaction of a single glance. I walked right past their table and approached the short flight of stairs leading up to the main stage. The private security guards standing near the steps moved forward instinctively to block my path. They reached out their hands to stop me, but Jared raised a trembling arm. He signaled for the guards to stand down immediately. He was completely mesmerized by the impossible reality standing right in front of him. I climbed the 4 carpeted steps with a steady and even rhythm. My joints did not ache, and my hands did not shake. Every single eye in that massive ballroom was locked onto my movements. The silence was so profound and absolute that you could hear the soft rustle of expensive fabrics as the audience held their collective breath. I stepped up to the clear acrylic podium and stood directly beside my son. Jared looked at me with eyes wide open, filled with a chaotic mixture of deep love, absolute shock, and profound confusion. He whispered the word "Dad" under his breath. It was a fragile and broken sound, like a child seeking reassurance. I looked at him and offered a small and steady nod to let him know that he was not losing his mind. I was really there, and my brain was perfectly lucid. I reached out and gently placed my hand over the microphone. I did not yank it away from him or push him aside. I simply took control of the stage with a calm and undeniable professional authority. I adjusted the metal stand so it aligned perfectly with my height. I looked out over the sea of wealthy faces staring back at me. I saw the media cameras blinking red, indicating that they were actively recording every single second of this confrontation. I looked down and saw Lauren standing near the front row. She looked like an animal caught in a brutal steel trap. She was desperately scanning the room, searching for an exit route or a lie that could save her, but there was absolutely nowhere left to hide. I lifted my right hand and presented the heavy manila folder. I held it up so the entire room could clearly see the thick stack of financial documents. This was the weapon I had spent days meticulously forging alongside his own corporate accountants. I turned my body slightly so I was facing Jared completely. I held the folder out toward him. I did not scream or yell or throw a theatrical tantrum. True power never requires volume. True power relies entirely on the devastating weight of undeniable facts. I extended the dossier directly into his chest, waiting for him to take hold of the devastating truth. Jared slowly raised his hands and took the heavy folder from my grip. He looked down at the thick manila envelope and then looked back up into my eyes. His brilliant software engineering brain was racing, trying to calculate what possible reason his supposedly sick father would have for handing him a massive stack of corporate paperwork in the middle of a high society gala. I kept my voice low and incredibly steady, ensuring the microphone picked up every single syllable I spoke. I told him that I loved him deeply. I told him that I was incredibly proud of the empire he had built from the ground up. Then I told him to open the folder and read the very first page. I told him that the foundation of his empire was actively rotting from the inside out. I told him that the parasite draining his family trust was standing right in the front row, wearing an emerald dress. The room remained locked in a state of absolute paralysis. Lauren took a sudden step forward toward the stage. She opened her mouth to scream or to interrupt, or to spin another massive web of lies about my mental state, but her vocal cords completely failed her. The sheer, unyielding presence I commanded on that stage stripped away her ability to manipulate the narrative. She was entirely defenseless in the bright spotlight. Jared slowly opened the metal clasp of the manila folder. The thick stack of financial audits, banking records, and property deeds was finally exposed to the bright stage lights. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and the devastating explosion was now only seconds away. Jared flipped open the heavy manila cover. The bright spotlight above us illuminated the crisp white pages of the forensic audit. He stared at the very first page. It was a summary report, officially stamped and signed by his own chief financial officer. I watched his eyes scan the lines of data. The entire ballroom held its breath. The silence was so heavy it felt like physical pressure pressing down on my shoulders. I could hear the faint rustle of the thick paper as Jared turned to the second page. He saw the incoming deposits of $8,000. Then his eyes moved to the adjacent column. He saw the automated electronic sweeps of $7,800, leaving the account exactly 48 hours later. His brow furrowed in deep and painful confusion. He flipped to the next section, revealing the detailed banking ledgers. The sheer volume of the stolen wealth was laid out in perfect chronological order, month after month and year after year. The numbers painted a brutal and undeniable picture of a parasitic drain on his family trust. The brilliant analytical mind of a software chief executive officer processed the undeniable math in a matter of seconds. Jared turned another page, and his breath hitched loudly. He was looking at the corporate registration documents for L Prime Holdings. He saw the name of his wife clearly listed as the sole managing director of the shell company. His hands began to shake violently, holding the heavy stack of paper. He flipped to the third section of the dossier. There it was in plain black and white. The official property deed and the county tax records for the sprawling beachfront estate in Miami. He saw the massive monthly mortgage payments, perfectly matching the exact amounts stolen from my survival fund. He flipped to the very back of the folder. He saw the glossy social media photographs printed directly by his own accounting team. The images showed Anthony and Barbara drinking expensive champagne on a tropical balcony. They were smiling and celebrating a luxurious retirement funded entirely by stolen money. Jared slowly looked up from the folder. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sick and hollow. The illusion of his perfect marriage shattered right in front of my eyes. He realized that the woman he loved had been systematically starving the father who gave him everything. Down on the main floor, Lauren could no longer maintain her paralyzed silence. She saw the absolute devastation spreading across the face of her husband. Pure panic overrode her ability to think clearly. She practically ran up the short flight of stairs, tripping slightly over the heavy hem of her expensive emerald gown. She reached the podium and desperately reached out to grab the folder from his hands. Jared jerked his arms away, stepping back from her as if she were a highly contagious disease. Lauren let out a loud and theatrical sob. Real tears began to stream down her face, completely ruining her pristine and expensive makeup. She cried out to him, her voice echoing through the silent ballroom. She begged him to listen to her. She pleaded with him to understand that it was not what it looked like. She desperately tried to reclaim control of the narrative. Jared stared at her with a look of pure and absolute disgust. He held up the property deed for the entire room to see. He told her that she stole from his father. His voice shook with a terrifying and cold fury. He told her that she left me to freeze in a crumbling apartment, while she bought a tropical mansion for her own parents. Lauren shook her head frantically, holding her hands up in a desperate plea. She sobbed loudly and launched into her final pathetic lie. She claimed it was an investment strategy. She swore to him that she was simply diversifying their financial portfolio to protect their assets. She claimed she was building a real estate safety net for our future. She even had the terrifying audacity to claim that she was going to move me down to Florida eventually so I could rest in the sun. She begged him to believe that she did it all for the family. Her lies sounded incredibly pathetic in the bright light of the stage. Jared shook his head slowly. The man standing beside me was a genius who built a billion-dollar empire based on logic and raw data. He knew that a legitimate investment strategy does not require forged medical powers of attorney. He knew that a financial safety net does not require starving an old man and hiding behind an invisible shell company. He looked down at the woman he married and saw nothing but a greedy and ruthless predator. He told her that his own chief financial officer had prepared the audit. He told her that the paper trail was absolutely undeniable and completely irrefutable. There was nowhere left for her to run. The math was merciless. The entire room of wealthy investors, media personalities, and local politicians watched in complete and stunned silence as the queen of high society was exposed as a common thief. The whispers rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Cameras began to flash, capturing the absolute destruction of her public image. Lauren turned her desperate and tear-filled eyes toward me. She glared at me with a hatred so deep and primal it was almost palpable. Her chest heaved as she struggled to breathe. She opened her mouth to hurl an insult. She wanted to tear me down one last time and assert her dominance, but she had absolutely nothing left. She was completely unarmed and totally exposed. Her wealth was a lie and her power was completely evaporated. I stood tall and perfectly composed in my tailored charcoal suit. I looked down at her completely unbothered by her desperate fury. I felt a profound and deep sense of peace wash over my tired bones. The long and freezing nightmare was finally over. I leaned closer to the microphone, ensuring my voice would carry to every single corner of that massive grand ballroom. You thought because I was old, I was invisible, but you forgot who taught my son how to build an empire. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Hundreds of wealthy investors and prominent politicians stared at the stage in absolute disbelief. The illusion of the perfect high society wife had been completely shattered, and there was absolutely nothing left but the ugly truth. I looked down at Lauren, who was still frozen at the base of the podium. She tried to look back at the audience to find a single sympathetic face, but her parents had already abandoned her. Anthony and Barbara were quietly slipping out the side doors, terrified that their own stolen lifestyle was about to be publicly exposed. Jared did not yell. He simply raised his hand and gave a silent signal to the head of his private security team. Two massive men in dark suits stepped forward and flanked Lauren on both sides. They calmly but firmly instructed her to walk toward the exit. She tried to resist for a brief moment, but the sheer weight of her public humiliation finally broke her spirit. She lowered her head and let them escort her down the center aisle. Her expensive emerald gown dragged heavily across the carpet, soaking up the champagne she had spilled earlier. The flashing cameras of the local media captured every single agonizing step of her departure. The queen of high society was marched out through the heavy wooden doors and expelled into the freezing night. Later that evening, the massive ballroom completely emptied out. Jared and I sat alone in a quiet dressing room behind the main stage. The young billionaire had taken off his tailored jacket and loosened his tie. He sat hunched over a small table, staring blankly at the thick manila folder containing the forensic audit. He looked like a lost and entirely broken little boy. He wept openly. He apologized repeatedly for being so incredibly blind to the manipulation happening right inside his own home. He apologized for letting his massive corporate wealth build an invisible wall between us. He told me how terrified he was when he realized how close Lauren had come to locking me away in a psychiatric ward just to steal my survival funds. Jared reached across the table and grabbed my hand. He begged me to pack my belongings immediately. He pleaded with me to move into his luxury penthouse in the center of the city. He promised to hire private chefs and round-the-clock medical staff to give me the life he thought I had been living all along. He wanted to smother me in luxury to ease his own crushing sense of guilt. I squeezed his hand gently and offered him a warm and reassuring smile. I looked him directly in the eyes and told him no. I told him that I did not want his luxury penthouse or his private chefs. I did not want to live in a gilded cage built on a foundation of overwhelming guilt. For the first time in many years, we had a completely honest and equal conversation. I explained that a retired auditor needs a quiet space of his own to think and breathe. I told him that I required my independence above all else. We agreed right then and there to start completely over. We agreed to rebuild our relationship from the ground up based on absolute truth and mutual respect instead of blind trust and unspoken assumptions. The legal fallout over the next few weeks was swift and completely merciless. Jared unleashed his entire corporate legal team on Lauren and her family. They moved with the cold efficiency of a machine. By Monday morning, they had completely frozen the accounts of the shell company. The beachfront estate in Miami was legally seized and quickly liquidated. Anthony and Barbara were evicted from their tropical paradise and forced to return to their ordinary and mundane lives. Lauren faced severe criminal charges for embezzlement, document forgery, and elder financial abuse. The expensive divorce proceedings stripped her of her designer clothes, her luxury vehicles, and the social status she valued above everything else. Every single stolen penny was carefully tracked down and returned directly to my family trust account. With my funds securely recovered, I did not buy a massive mansion. I did not seek out a luxury senior living community filled with amenities I did not need. Instead, I purchased a comfortable and modest brick house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It has a warm stone fireplace, a small garden in the back, and thick insulated windows that keep the freezing Chicago wind completely outside where it belongs. It is perfectly quiet, perfectly safe, and entirely mine. Jared visits me every single Sunday afternoon. He does not come out of a sense of obligation. He does not send an assistant with a generic greeting card or a superficial gift. He comes because he genuinely wants to spend time with me. We sit on my back porch, drink black coffee, and talk about life and the future. He asks for my advice on business matters, and he listens to my answers. He finally understands the true value of the man who raised him. On Tuesday mornings, I still wake up early and put on a heavy coat. I still walk down the street to the local community church. But I no longer stand outside in the freezing cold, waiting in a long line for a hot meal. Now I walk straight through the front doors and put on a volunteer apron. I stand behind the long wooden tables, handing out hot soup and fresh bread to the people who need it the most. I made a substantial and quiet financial donation to ensure the pantry never runs out of resources. I continue to serve the community that kept me alive during my darkest days, but I do it entirely on my own terms, standing tall and full of renewed purpose. Looking back at everything that happened, the greatest lesson I learned is that true power does not reside in loud threats or flashy displays of wealth. True power lives in patience, observation, and the quiet dignity of knowing exactly who you are. People who are driven entirely by greed will always underestimate those who operate with integrity. They mistake silence for weakness, and they mistake age for incompetence. You must never let anyone strip away your voice or your autonomy, regardless of how close they are to you. When you demand respect and set unbreakable boundaries, you build a personal fortress that no amount of manipulation can ever breach. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment below and share your own experiences with setting boundaries.